Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a world where your daily bread was a potential death trap, and culinary skills were less about Michelin stars and more about not accidentally poisoning your entire village. We're going back to the age of long ships, sagas, and some seriously questionable kitchen practices. Imagine yourself there, bundled in rough wool, the biting wind whipping around your makeshift outdoor kitchen, the constant threat of smoke inhalation, or a poorly butchered boar lurking around every corner. You probably won't survive this, honestly. It was brutal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And seriously, I'm curious. Drop your current location and local time in the comments below. Let's see how far and wide our little history-loving community stretches tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing by a roaring fire, its smoke stinging your eyes, but at least it's keeping the biting Scandinavian chill at bay. Your hands, already calloused and perpetually smelling of fish and ash, are busy tending to a bubbling cauldron. You're not just a cook, you're a survivalist, a chemist, and occasionally an unwitting purveyor of mild food poisoning. Being a Viking cook wasn't about crafting gourmet meals. It was about keeping people alive, which, given the circumstances, was often a monumental task. The dangers weren't just the obvious ones, like a rogue spark igniting your thatched roof, or a clumsy slip sending you headfirst into the hot embers. Oh no, the perils were far more insidious, woven into the very fabric of daily life and every meal you prepared. Think about it. Your pantry consisted of whatever could be hunted, fished, gathered, or salvaged. There were no refrigerators, no freezers, certainly no best before dates. Preservation was a dark art involving salting, smoking, drying, and fermenting, all processes that, if done incorrectly, could turn a life-sustaining meal into a slow, agonizing poison. You'd be constantly vigilant, sniffing, prodding, and tasting, hoping your instincts were sharper than the bacteria growing on that slightly too old piece of smoked salmon. Historians still argue whether some of the common illnesses of the time were due to genuine foodborne pathogens or simply severe nutritional deficiencies. It was a fine line. Every cut you made, every fire you stoked, was a dance with potential disaster. Imagine butchering a wild boar, its powerful muscles and sharp tusks making it a formidable opponent even after death. One wrong slip of your crudely fashioned bone knife, and you're not just dealing with a cut, but a deep wound susceptible to infection in an era before antibiotics were even a twinkle in a scientist's eye. And then there's the cooking itself. You're constantly surrounded by open flames, heavy iron pots, and boiling liquids. Burns were a daily occupational hazard, from minor singes to debilitating injuries that could leave you unable to work, a dangerous prospect in a society where self-sufficiency was paramount. Remember that time you almost tipped the entire pot of fish stew onto your feet? Your quick reflexes saved you from a truly nasty scalding, but the memory lingers like the smell of stale ale. The very air you breathed as a Viking cook was a hazard. Cooking was often done indoors, especially during the long, brutal winters, in smoke-filled longhouses where ventilation was an afterthought. The constant inhalation of wood smoke would slowly, inexorably, damage your lungs. Coughs were common, and chronic respiratory issues were almost a given. You'd frequently emerge from the smoky interior, blinking, your eyes watering, smelling like a bonfire, just to gasp some fresh, frigid air. It's no wonder life expectancy wasn't exactly hitting modern-day numbers. beyond the physical risks, there was the immense pressure. Your community, your family, depended on you. A failed harvest, a poor hunting season, or a botched preservation job wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a threat to collective survival. You were responsible for ensuring enough food was prepared and stored to last through the lean months, a logistical nightmare even today, let alone with rudimentary tools and a rudimentary understanding of nutrition. One mainstream historical fact often overlooked is how interconnected food production and community survival truly were. A cook's failure could literally lead to widespread starvation. Consider the ingredients themselves. You're not popping down to the supermarket for pre-washed organic greens. You're out in the wild, identifying edible plants, knowing which berries are safe and which will send you spiraling into a debilitating, perhaps fatal, illness. There's no comprehensive guide. It's passed down knowledge, often learned through painful trial and error. That quirky tidbit about Viking diet often involves finding trace elements of psychedelic mushrooms or poisonous nightshade, indicating that not every foraging expedition went to plan. You had to be a botanist, a hunter, a gatherer, and then somehow transform these disparate, often raw, and potentially dangerous components into something nourishing. It was a role that demanded constant vigilance, an encyclopedic knowledge of your environment, and an iron stomach. The sea. For a Viking, it was everything. A highway for raids, a source of life. And for you, a cook, a veritable supermarket that could turn on you in an instant. Your relationship with seafood was a complex one, a dance between bounty and peril. You'd stand on the frigid shoreline, watching the longships return, their holds laden with cod, herring, and mackerel. The sight was a relief, a promise that for a little while the gnawing hunger would be kept at bay. But the real work and the real danger began the moment the nets were hauled in. You see, fresh fish was a luxury. Most of the catch had to be preserved immediately, and your methods were, by modern standards, a biological minefield. Salting was the most common technique, a race against time to pack the fish in barrels of sea salt before it began to spoil. But what if the salt wasn't pure enough? What if the barrel wasn't sealed correctly? Even a slight error could lead to putrefaction, and that's when things got truly grim. Eating tainted fish didn't just give you a stomachache. It could lead to botulism, a paralyzing and often fatal illness. And you were the one who had to make the call, sniffing and prodding the preserved catch, praying your nose was sensitive enough to detect the invisible enemy within. Remember that time you had to throw out an entire barrel of herring because it just didn't smell right? The angry glares from the hungry warriors still sting. Beyond the preservation, there was the sheer monotony of the seafood-heavy diet. You were a master of 100 ways to make gruel with dried fish, and a dozen more ways to smoke it. But a lack of variety meant a lack of essential nutrients. A mainstream historical fact is that Viking diets, while rich in protein and fat, were often deficient in vitamins, especially C. Scurvy was a constant lurking threat, slowly weakening the gums, causing teeth to fall out, and making even the simplest cut a life-threatening ordeal. You'd see the telltale signs in the older warriors, the fatigue and the sore joints, and you'd know that no matter how much fish you prepared, it wasn't enough to fend off the slow march of disease. Then there were the less common catches, the things that were a treat but came with their own set of risks. Mussels, oysters, and other shellfish were a delicacy, but they were also sponges for whatever pollutants were in the local water. A quirky tidbit is that traces of toxins from red tides or harmful algal blooms have been found in the remains of Viking coastal settlements, suggesting that a celebratory feast could, and sometimes did, turn into a mass poisoning event. You had to know the waters, the tides, and the signs of danger, a skill that was more art than science. A mistake meant not just a ruined meal, but potentially a ruined village. But the ocean wasn't just a larder, it was a character in your story. You'd spend hours by the fire, cooking, but the stories you'd hear were all about the sea. The fishermen would talk of their near capsizes, the warriors of their raids, and the sailors of the mythical beasts that lurked beneath the waves. For you, the cook, this meant you were constantly having to prepare food that was easy to store, transport, and eat on a long ship. We'll get to the horrors of travel rations later, but for now, just imagine trying to cook for a dozen hardened warriors on a small, open deck. Waves crashing over the side, a small fire threatening to go out, or worse, to set the whole ship ablaze. The very essence of your existence was tied to this watery world, and the food you prepared reflected its unpredictable nature. It was a cycle of abundance and scarcity, of triumph and disaster. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' expansion was driven by a thirst for conquest or simply a desperate need for more land and more resources to feed their growing populations. You, standing over your cauldron, knew the answer wasn't a grand political theory, but something much simpler. Hunger. The hunger you felt, the hunger you saw in the eyes of your neighbors, the hunger that made a spoiled piece of fish a tragedy and a successful catch a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. It's a stark reminder that history isn't just made by kings and battles, but by the everyday struggles of people just trying to get a decent meal. When the sea didn't provide, the land had to. And for you, the Viking cook, this meant an entirely new set of exhausting, dangerous tasks. Forget the convenience of a modern butcher shop. Every piece of meat that made it to your cauldron was the result of a brutal, often weeks-long process. The hunt was just the beginning. You'd watch the men return from the forest, their shoulders heavy with a stag or a wild boar, its hide still caked with mud and blood. The relief of seeing a successful hunt was quickly replaced by the daunting, messy work that followed. Butchering an animal wasn't a quick or clean job. You'd have to use your crude tools, a couple of sharp stones, a bronze knife if you were lucky, to skin the beast and break down its carcass. The risk of cutting yourself was constant, and in a world without antiseptic, a deep gash could easily fester and become a death sentence. And you had to be meticulous. Every part of the animal, from the sinews to the organs, was a resource. Nothing could be wasted. You'd boil the bones for broth, render the fat for cooking and lamps, and even use the hide and sinew for crafting. It was a painstaking, foul-smelling process that defined a significant portion of your life. And then there was the preservation. Just like with the fish, you couldn't eat it all at once. The meat had to be cured, usually by salting or smoking, to last through the long, barren winter months. Imagine hanging strips of meat in the smoky rafters of the longhouse, the constant acrid smoke from the central hearth doing its slow, preserving work. The process was effective, but it came with its own health risks. Constant exposure to smoke, as we've talked about, was terrible for your lungs. A quirky tidbit is that traces of carcinogenic compounds from wood smoke have been found in the teeth of ancient Scandinavians, a silent testament to the daily price they paid for food preservation. It's a subtle but constant reminder that every meal you served had a layer of environmental hazard baked into it. The quality of the meat itself was a roll of the dice. You weren't raising domesticated cows in a pasture, though some villages did have livestock. Much of the meat came from the wild, from animals that could be diseased, or simply tough and sinewy from a life of survival. Cooking had to be a long, slow process to make the meat tender and edible. This meant hours spent tending the fire, constantly adding wood and stirring the pot. It was an exercise in patience and endurance. A mainstream historical fact is that much of the Viking diet was based on what could be caught or killed, which meant that the availability of meat fluctuated wildly with the seasons and the success of hunting expeditions. This led to a diet that was either feast or famine, a cycle that took a severe toll on the bodies of the people you were feeding. The social aspect of meat was also a big deal. Feasts were a rare occasion, a chance to show off wealth and power. When a chieftain or a wealthy farmer slaughtered a pig or a goat for a celebration, it wasn't just a meal, it was a social event. But for you, the cook, it was an incredibly stressful performance. You had to prepare the feast perfectly, or risk a social faux pas that could have lasting consequences. And you were expected to do it with your basic tools, in a smoky, chaotic environment, often with drunk warriors getting in your way. It was a high-pressure, high-stakes job with little thanks. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' fierce raiding culture was a primary cause or a consequence of their dietary challenges. Was it a simple hunger for more fertile land and more abundant resources that drove them to the sea? Or was the raiding a way to acquire wealth and status, with food as a secondary benefit? From your perspective, standing over a bubbling cauldron of tough, stringy venison, the answer seemed obvious. The need for sustenance was a powerful motivator, a constant, gnawing presence that shaped not only your daily routine, but the very course of your people's history. The men went out to raid and hunt, and you, the cook, stayed behind to turn their bloody, perilous bounty into something that could keep the community alive for another day, another week, another winter. It was a role of quiet, thankless, and constant heroism. When meat and fish were scarce, which was often, your daily survival depended on what you could find on foot. Foraging was your last line of defense against starvation, and it was a job that demanded intimate knowledge of the land, a sharp eye, and a little bit of luck. You weren't just looking for food, you were looking for edible plants, knowing which ones would nourish and which ones would kill. This was a high-stakes scavenger hunt with your life and the lives of your community hanging in the balance. The forest floor was your garden. You'd spend hours kneeling in the damp earth, searching for wild berries, mushrooms, and edible roots. You knew the seasons by what they provided. The sweet taste of wild raspberries in the short summer, the earthy flavor of mushrooms in the autumn. But this knowledge was never absolute. Some plants have edible and poisonous lookalikes, and one wrong pick could be a disaster. A quirky tidbit is that while Vikings were well versed in local flora, a surprising number of ancient Norse remains show evidence of poisoning from plants like hemlock and deadly nightshade, indicating that even the most experienced foragers made fatal mistakes. There was no field guide, no app to check. It was just you and your memory, and the constant fear of a misidentification. You had to be a master of all seasons. In the spring, you'd be looking for young nettles and dandelions, bitter but packed with nutrients after a long, lean winter. In the summer, you'd be collecting berries and herbs, trying to dry and store as many as you could for the months ahead. The autumn harvest was crucial, a final push to gather everything before the first frost. This meant you were often competing with the wildlife, and a good patch of berries could be cleared out by bears or boars before you even got to it. It was a race against nature, and you were often on the losing side. But foraging wasn't just about survival. It was also about flavor. You'd gather wild garlic, thyme, and other herbs to flavor the otherwise bland gruels and stews. These plants were your spices, your only way to break the monotony of salt and smoke. Imagine the joy of finding a patch of wild onions, a rare and pungent treat that could make a simple fish broth feel like a feast. These small triumphs were what kept you going, the moments of discovery that reminded you of the land's generosity, even in the face of its harshness. A mainstream historical fact is that the Viking diet was heavily reliant on root vegetables and wild grains, like barley and oats, which could be grown in the short growing season. But even these had to be supplemented with foraged goods to provide a balanced diet. You'd be working with the harvested grains, grinding them by hand, a back-breaking process that could take hours. We'll get to the misery of that later. But for now, just know that your foraging was a necessary supplement, a way to add essential nutrients and variety to a diet that was otherwise dominated by a few key staples. The danger wasn't just in the plants themselves. Foraging meant venturing away from the safety of the longhouse into the wild, where wolves, bears, and other predators roamed. You were a solitary figure, a woman often, armed with nothing but a small basket and your knowledge of the forest. The rustle of a branch, the snap of a twig, every sound would put you on edge. It was a quiet, constant terror that you lived with, a reminder that the land that fed you could also take your life in an instant. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' knowledge of herbal remedies was more widespread or more specialized than previously thought. Were you, the cook, also a healer? Were you expected to know which plants could soothe a fever or stop a wound from bleeding? The lines between cook, forager, and healer were often blurred in Viking society, and you likely carried the weight of all three roles. Your job was not just to put food on the table, but to keep your people healthy, a task that required a deep, almost spiritual connection to the natural world. It was a profound responsibility, and one you bore with the quiet strength of someone who knew that life and death could be found in the simplest of things. The backbone of any Viking meal, the thing that kept you from starving during the long, dark winters, wasn't meat or fish. It was gruel. This simple, often bland porridge was the unglamorous hero of the Viking diet. And for you, the cook, it was an all-consuming, physically punishing reality. Preparing a simple bowl of gruel was an epic journey in itself, a testament to the sheer effort required to turn raw ingredients into something edible. It all started with the grain. Barley and oats were your staples, grown in the fields surrounding your village. But they didn't arrive ready to cook. You had to mill them yourself, a backbreaking process that could take hours, even days, to produce enough flour for the community. You'd be hunched over a heavy quernstone, a large, flat rock with a smaller, rounded stone on top. You'd pour the grain between the stones, and with all your might, grind the top stone in a circular motion, crushing the tough kernels into a coarse flour. The constant friction produced a fine dust that would get everywhere, in your hair, on your clothes, and inevitably in your lungs. It was an exercise in pure, monotonous endurance, your muscles aching and your hands raw. Remember the feeling of that rough stone under your palms, the rhythmic scrape and crunch that was the soundtrack to so much of your life? A mainstream historical fact is that this manual grinding process was so labor-intensive that it was often seen as one of the most grueling household chores, and the development of water-powered mills in later eras was a revolutionary technological leap. For you, though, It was just the reality of every single day. The flour you produced was coarse and full of husks, a far cry from the fine, white flour of later centuries. This meant your gruel wasn't just a smooth porridge. It was a rough, textured mix that often felt more like a bowl of grit. Once you had the grain, the cooking began. You'd mix the coarse flour with water, and sometimes a little sour milk or ale to help it ferment and add flavor, and then you'd cook it over the fire. This was where your skills as a fire tender came in. Too hot, and the gruel would scorch to the bottom of the pot, a tragic waste of precious resources. Too cool, and it would take forever to cook, draining your limited firewood. You had to be constantly stirring, a long wooden paddle in your hand, your arm growing tired from the endless motion. The smell of the simmering grain was a constant presence, a warm, earthy scent that was the smell of survival itself. But gruel wasn't just a simple porridge. It was a canvas for whatever ingredients you could spare. Sometimes you'd add a few precious drops of honey or a handful of foraged berries to make it sweet. Other times, you'd mix in a few bits of smoked fish or some leftover meat to turn it into a savory stew. This was where your culinary creativity, however limited, came into play. You had to stretch every ingredient as far as it would go, and a spoonful of honey or a small piece of bacon could make the difference between a tolerable meal and a moment of genuine pleasure. Historians still argue whether the Viking diet was as bland as we imagine. Were there more complex spices and herbs available through trade or foraging than we currently have evidence for? From your perspective, the answer was simple. You used what you had. The food you prepared was not for pleasure, but for purpose. It was fuel for the warriors on their raids, sustenance for the farmers in their fields, and nourishment for the children who were the future of your village. The gruel you made, humble and gritty as it was the lifeblood of your community. And you, the one who bore the scars of its creation, were its quiet, uncelebrated guardian. A quirky tidbit is that traces of fermented grain have been found in ancient cooking pots, suggesting that a sour, fermented gruel was a common and accepted part of the Viking diet, perhaps even preferred for its preserving qualities and distinct tangy flavor. So, every bowl you served wasn't just a meal. It was a living, breathing piece of your culture, a testament to the simple, brutal realities of life in the age of the Vikings. Fire. It was your closest ally and your most terrifying enemy. As a Viking cook, you lived by it. You breathed it, and you constantly, acutely felt its power. Without fire, there was no cooked food, no warmth in the biting cold, and no way to preserve your precious stores. But with fire came 1,000 threats, from the immediate danger of a misplaced spark to the slow, insidious toll it took on your very breath. Your kitchen was essentially a controlled bonfire in the center of the longhouse, or a makeshift pit outdoors when the weather allowed. There was no modern stove, no gas burner with an adjustable flame. You had to master the art of building and maintaining a fire with a rough-hewn wood, often damp or green, and then controlling its heat for hours on end. This meant constantly feeding it, adjusting logs and raking embers, all while dodging the billowing smoke. A quirky tidbit about Viking hearths is that they often had sophisticated smoke holes or vents in the roof, but these were far from perfect, especially on windy days, leading to very smoky interiors. You were practically a chimney sweep just by existing in your workspace. The most immediate danger was, of course, the risk of a blaze. Your longhouse, built from timber and thatch, was essentially a giant tinderbox. A single errant spark from the open hearth could ignite the dry straw on the floor or the wooden beams above, turning your home into an inferno in minutes. You had to be constantly vigilant, sweeping embers away, making sure nothing flammable was too close. Imagine the sheer terror of seeing a small flame catch, knowing that your entire village could go up in smoke in the blink of an eye, taking with it all your food stores and your shelter. Every cook knew someone who had lost everything to fire, or worse, lost their life trying to save it. It was a constant, simmering fear just beneath the surface of your daily routine. Beyond the catastrophic, there were the everyday dangers. Burns were a given. You'd constantly singe your hair, blister your hands, or get a painful splash of boiling gruel on your skin. Your clothes, woolen and rough, were always at risk of catching fire, especially if you leaned too close to tend a pot. You learned to move with a cautious precision around the hearth, your body instinctively aware of the heat and the danger, like a dancer performing a perilous routine. And then there was the ash. It coated everything, your food, your tools, your very skin. You'd wash your hands again and again, but the fine, gritty dust seemed to permeate everything. But the most pervasive and insidious threat was the smoke. As we touched upon earlier, living and working in a smoke-filled environment for hours every day took a severe toll on your lungs. Chronic coughs, wheezing, and respiratory infections were common. A mainstream historical fact is that archaeological findings of human remains from Viking Age settlements often show evidence of lung disease consistent with long-term smoke inhalation. You might not have understood the science, but you certainly felt the symptoms. The tightness in your chest, the burning in your throat, the constant struggle for a full, clean breath. It was a slow poison, a hidden cost of keeping your community fed and warm. Historians still argue whether the Vikings fully understood the long-term health consequences of their indoor fires, or if it was simply an accepted part of life. For you, it was the only way. The choice was never between a clean kitchen and a smoky one, but between cooking and freezing, between food and starvation. You accepted the coughing fits and the stinging eyes as the price of survival. The fire was your heart, the source of all nourishment and warmth, and you, the cook, were its guardian, tending it with respect and a healthy dose of fear. The fire's heat was also vital for preservation. Smoking meat and fish required a carefully controlled, continuous heat, often for days on end. You couldn't let it get too hot, lest you cook the food instead of just smoking it. And you couldn't let it die down, or your efforts would be wasted. This meant sleepless nights, constantly checking the smoking racks, adding just the right amount of damp wood to create that slow, pungent smoke that would cure the food for months. It was a solitary, tiring vigil, but an essential one. You were both the master and the servant of the flame, eternally bound to its demands, forever shaped by its power. You had a name for every pot and pan, for every utensil in your little arsenal. They weren't just tools. They were extensions of your hands, scarred and worn from years of service. But unlike a modern kitchen, your implements were crude, often unhygienic, and a constant source of frustration and potential danger. Your most prized possession was probably a simple iron cauldron, a heavy, soot-stained vessel that hung over the fire, a precious piece of metal that was a luxury in its own right. It was your workhorse, the centerpiece of every meal, and you treated it with the respect it deserved. But everything else was a step down from there. Your knives were likely made of bone or bronze, far from the razor-sharp steel blades of later eras. They dulled quickly, and sharpening them was a constant chore. Trying to butcher a tough piece of meat with a dull knife was an exercise in pure brute force, increasing the risk of a slip and a serious wound. You'd have to use a whetstone, a simple piece of rock, to grind the edge back to a semblance of sharpness, your movements slow and deliberate. A quirky tidbit is that while Vikings were famous for their high-quality swords, the average household cooking knife was often a simple, utilitarian tool, far less refined than the weapons used in battle. The contrast between the tools of war and the tools of sustenance was stark. Your plates and bowls were most likely carved from wood, simple trenchers that you shared with your family and community. They were porous, difficult to clean, and over time became a breeding ground for bacteria. You couldn't just pop them in a dishwasher. Cleaning involved scraping them with a knife and a quick rinse in the nearest stream, a practice that did little to truly sanitize them. Remember that sticky film that seemed to coat everything? A residue of fat and old food that you could never quite get rid of? That was the reality of your kitchen hygiene, or lack thereof. Spoons were also carved from wood or bone, and the same hygiene issues applied. You'd use them to stir the gruel, to taste the stew, and to eat your meals, but they were never truly clean. A mainstream historical fact is that poor sanitation and hygiene were major contributors to disease in the Viking Age, and the shared, unwashed communal bowls and utensils were likely vectors for the spread of pathogens. It's a sobering thought that a simple family meal could also be a silent, invisible killer. And what about the cooking surfaces? There were none, really. The fire was on the ground, and your cauldron hung above it from an iron hook. You didn't have a stable countertop to work on. You'd be butchering meat on a rough-hewn log or a flat stone, and preparing vegetables on the floor of the longhouse, a space that was shared with people, dogs, and all manner of dirt and detritus. The separation between your food and the filthy ground was minimal, a constant source of contamination that you had to simply accept as part of life. The lack of specialized tools meant you had to be incredibly resourceful. You'd use a heated stone to boil water in a leather pouch, a technique that was clever but also precarious. You'd use a piece of bark to scrape the sides of a bowl, a sharpened stick to turn meat over the fire. You were a master of improvisation, a testament to the fact that necessity is, indeed, the mother of invention. Your ingenuity was born not of a desire for innovation, but of a desperate need to get the job done with whatever was at hand. Historians still argue whether some of the folk remedies of the time, like boiling water with specific herbs, were more about a rudimentary understanding of sterilization than they were about superstition. Were you, the cook, unknowingly practicing a form of sanitation by boiling your water and your utensils? Or was it just a lucky coincidence? From your perspective, it didn't matter. You did what you had to do to survive, to make sure the food you prepared was at least as safe as you could possibly make it. It was a thankless task, with little praise for your successes and harsh criticism for your failures. Your hands, perpetually stained with dirt and ash, were the hands of a true artist, one who could turn crude, dangerous tools into a means of survival for her people. For most of the year, life was a struggle, a monotonous march from one meager meal to the next. But there were moments, rare and glorious, that broke the cycle, the feast. As a cook, these occasions were both a monumental stress and a chance to show off your skills. A feast wasn't just a big meal. It was a social event, a political tool, and a religious ceremony all rolled into one. It was a brief, shining period of abundance in a world defined by scarcity. You'd spend weeks preparing for a feast, The pressure was immense. You weren't just feeding a family, you were feeding the entire community, and often guests from other villages. This meant you had to coordinate with hunters, farmers, and foragers to bring in enough food for dozens, sometimes over 100 people. A mainstream historical fact is that Viking feasts were often used to solidify alliances, distribute wealth, and reinforce social hierarchies. The food you prepared wasn't just sustenance, it was a symbol of the chieftain's power and generosity. And you, the cook, were the one responsible for making that symbol shine. The menu for a feast would be a massive step up from your daily gruel. There would be roasted meat, perhaps a whole boar or a few sheep, slowly turning on a spit over a massive fire. You'd have to constantly baste it, a long wooden ladle in your hand, its handle growing hot from the proximity to the flames. The smell of the roasting meat, rich and savory, would fill the smoky longhouse, a scent so rare and wonderful that it could almost make you forget the months of bland porridge. But the cooking was a high-stakes performance. Too little heat, and the meat would be raw and dangerous. Too much, and it would burn to a crisp, a tragic waste that would bring shame to the entire hall. But a feast wasn't just about meat. You'd also be preparing large cauldrons of fish stew, flavored with whatever wild herbs you had managed to gather and preserve. There would be loaves of bread, a precious commodity, baked on hot stones or in a simple clay oven. The baking itself was a delicate process. A wrong temperature could ruin an entire batch. A quirky tidbit is that Viking bread was often a coarse, unleavened flatbread, and sometimes even a spongy fermented bread made from sourdough, a far cry from the fluffy loaves we know today. It was dense, nutritious, and hard as a rock if you weren't careful. Alongside the food, there was the mead and ale. While you might not have been the brewer, you were certainly involved in preparing the ingredients and serving the drinks. You'd have to keep a steady supply of jugs filled, the heavy vessels taking a toll on your back and arms. The atmosphere of a feast was a chaotic, joyful, and often drunken one. You'd be a ghost in the background, constantly working, making sure everyone was fed and watered, even as the sagas were being told and the songs were being sung. You were the engine of the celebration, but you rarely got to be a part of it. Historians still argue whether the extreme feasting and famine cycles of Viking life had a significant impact on their physical and psychological health. Did the long periods of scarcity make the feasting more impactful, or did the sudden influx of rich food cause its own set of health problems? From your perspective, the answer was probably both. The feasts were a moment of genuine relief and joy, a chance to feel full and nourished for the first time in what felt like forever. But you also knew that as soon as the feast was over, the grind would begin again. You'd have to go back to making gruel, to foraging for roots, and to the constant, gnawing hunger that defined the rest of your year. The memory of the feast was a powerful one, a source of hope in the dark months, but it was also a cruel reminder of how little you had most of the time. In the Viking world, the concept of hygiene was, to put it mildly, a luxury. As a cook, this was a constant, filthy reality that you had to contend with every single day. The battle against germs, bacteria, and grime was a losing one, and it took a silent, invisible toll on everyone you fed. There were no soaps, no sanitizers, and no understanding of microbiology. Your kitchen and the world around it was a breeding ground for disease, and you were at the center of it all. Let's start with the basics, your hands. You were constantly handling raw meat, fresh-caught fish, and unwashed vegetables, and the only way to clean your hands was to rinse them in cold water from a nearby stream or well. You couldn't get the grime out from under your fingernails, and the constant smell of fish and animal fat clung to you like a second skin. A quirky tidbit is that while Vikings were known for their love of bathing and their use of combs and grooming kits, this was often a social ritual and a sign of status, not a daily practice in sanitation. The cleanliness of a warrior's hair and beard didn't necessarily extend to the cleanliness of the person cooking their food. The cooking surfaces were no better. As we've already discussed, you were often working on rough wooden logs or flat stones on the ground. These surfaces were impossible to truly sanitize. They were porous, and over time, they became saturated with the blood, fat, and juices of every animal you butchered. Even if you scraped them clean, the microscopic pathogens would remain, ready to contaminate the next piece of food you placed on them. The line between your food and the filthy ground was blurred, a constant source of contamination that you simply had to live with. And what about the water? Water was a precious commodity, but it was also a vector for disease. You'd fetch water from the river or a communal well, but there was no guarantee it was clean. Runoff from the animal pens, human waste, and other sources could easily contaminate your water supply. A mainstream historical fact is that waterborne diseases, like dysentery and cholera, were rampant in ancient and medieval societies, and the Viking Age was no exception. Every drink of water, every pot of gruel you made with it, carried a hidden risk. You might have tried to boil the water to make it safer, but this was a time-consuming process that you couldn't always afford to do. The communal living of the longhouse also contributed to the lack of hygiene. Everyone ate from shared bowls and used shared utensils, and there was little understanding of how disease spread. Someone with a stomach bug could easily contaminate the entire community with a single shared ladle. The close quarters meant that illness, once it took hold, could spread like wildfire, and your job, as the one who prepared and served the food, put you on the front lines of that war. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' harsh environment and a constant struggle for survival made them more resilient to disease or simply meant that many illnesses went unrecorded. From your perspective, the reality was simple. People got sick, and it was often a mystery why. You'd do your best to keep things as clean as possible, but you were fighting a battle you couldn't see, with weapons you didn't have. You were a cook, not a doctor, and the constant threat of sickness was just another layer of the danger you faced every day. The memory of that one time a whole family got sick after eating a batch of mussels still haunts you, a reminder that your best efforts weren't always enough to protect the people you loved. The flies, the vermin, the stray dogs that would wander in and out of the hall, all of these were a constant presence, a reminder of the raw, unpolished nature of your world. You'd spend hours swatting flies away from the drying meat and chasing the rats from the grain stores, a thankless, unending task. Your life was a testament to the fact that survival isn't always glamorous. It's a messy, dirty, and often brutal business, and you were the one who had to deal with the grime, the risk, and the filth to make sure your community lived to see another day. The constant cycle of feast and famine wasn't just a matter of having enough to eat. It was a matter of health. As a Viking cook, you had to watch as the people you fed suffered from a host of ailments and diseases, many of them stemming directly from the limitations of the Viking diet. You weren't just preparing food. You were fighting a silent losing battle against nutritional deficiencies and the sicknesses they brought on. Scurvy, as we've mentioned, was a constant, lurking threat. It's caused by a lack of vitamin C, something that's abundant in fresh fruits and vegetables. But in the long, dark Scandinavian winters, those were a rarity. You'd see the telltale signs, the swollen gums, the loose teeth, the general weakness and fatigue. A quirky tidbit is that while Vikings didn't understand the concept of vitamins, they did know that certain foraged plants like scurvy grass and wild onions seemed to help. You'd make a point of adding these to your gruels whenever you could, a desperate attempt to stave off the slow, painful march of the disease. But it was rarely enough. Beyond scurvy, there was the issue of iron deficiency. A mainstream historical fact is that anemia was common in Viking society, particularly among women. While the diet was rich in meat and fish, the constant presence of smoke and the lack of certain vegetables meant that iron absorption was often poor. You'd see the women in your community, pale and weak, their energy levels so low they could barely work. And you knew, deep down, that the fault wasn't theirs, but a simple lack of available resources. There was only so much you could do with the tools and ingredients at your disposal. Then there was the issue of dental health. The coarse, gritty flour you spent hours grinding by hand was terrible for your teeth. It was full of tiny stone particles and husks that would slowly but surely grind down your enamel. You'd see people with worn-down, flat teeth, a constant source of pain and infection. A toothache wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a debilitating condition that could lead to a life-threatening abscess. You couldn't just visit a dentist. Your only recourse was to hope that a tooth fell out on its own, or to have a village elder try to pull it with a crude pair of tongs. The pain was excruciating, and you'd often have to make special, soft foods for people who could no longer chew. The constant feast and famine cycle also took a toll on the body. During periods of scarcity, you'd be forced to stretch your food stores to their absolute limit, often going for days on nothing but water and a thin gruel. Your body would go into survival mode, and you'd feel the gnawing hunger in your stomach and the constant weakness in your limbs. But then, when a feast finally came, the sudden influx of rich, fatty food could cause its own set of problems. Your digestive system, unaccustomed to such a heavy load, would rebel, leading to stomach pain and other digestive issues. It was a vicious cycle, a physical representation of the unpredictability of your world. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' fierce raiding culture was a response to these dietary pressures. Was the need for more fertile land, more abundant food sources, a primary driver of their expansion? From your perspective, it certainly felt that way. You, the cook, were on the front lines of this battle for survival. You saw the physical toll it took on your people, the weakness, the sickness, the pain. And you knew that every meal you prepared was a small, temporary victory in a war that never truly ended. You were a guardian of health, a quiet healer in a world that didn't have a name for your job, and you carried the weight of your community's well-being on your perpetually tired shoulders. The mead hall wasn't just a place for feasting and storytelling. It was the heart of the community. And for you, the cook, it was the most challenging kitchen you could imagine. This massive, smoky building, with its central fire pit and its long communal tables, was a logistical nightmare. Cooking for a large group in such a chaotic and poorly ventilated space was a true test of your endurance and skill. The atmosphere was a thick, smoky haze, a constant assault on your eyes and lungs, and you were at the center of it all. The fire pit was your main cooking surface, a roaring hearth in the middle of the hall that provided warmth and light, but also filled the air with a choking smoke. There were no separate kitchens, no back rooms to retreat to. You were cooking in full view of everyone, a constant pressure to perform. Imagine trying to roast a whole boar over an open fire while a dozen warriors are telling sagas, their laughter and shouts echoing around you. The noise, the smoke, the constant interruptions. It was a recipe for disaster. A mainstream historical fact is that the central hearth was the defining feature of the mead hall, and its presence, while essential for survival, meant that the air quality was a major health concern for all who lived there. Your cauldron, a heavy iron pot, would hang from a chain over the fire, and you'd spend hours stirring its contents, your arm growing tired from the constant motion. You had to constantly adjust the height of the cauldron, lowering it to bring the stew to a boil and raising it to let it simmer. This was a precarious dance, with the risk of a slip or a burn always present. And you couldn't just leave it. A pot of unattended gruel could easily scorch or boil over, a tragic waste of precious food. You were a constant presence by the fire, a ghost in the background, but the entire community depended on your vigilance. The floor of the mead hall was a filthy mess. It was covered in rushes, which were meant to absorb spills and dirt, but in reality, they were a breeding ground for bacteria and vermin. A quirky tidbit is that these rushes were rarely changed, and over time, they would become a thick, putrid layer of old food, animal waste, and general filth. Imagine trying to prepare food in such an environment, with dogs and pigs wandering in and out of the hall, and the constant risk of contamination. You'd have to be extra careful, but in such a chaotic space, a dropped piece of food was a common occurrence, and once it hit the ground, it was lost forever. The mead hall was also a place of social hierarchy, and this extended to the food. You would serve the chieftain and the most important guests first, and their portions would be the most generous. The rest of the community would get what was left over, a system that reinforced the social order. You, the cook, were a part of this system, and you had to follow the rules, even if it meant some people went hungry while others feasted. It was a role that required a deep understanding of the social dynamics of your community and a quiet resignation to your place within it. Historians still argue whether the mead hall was primarily a place of celebration or a practical necessity for communal living. Was it a symbol of Viking power and culture, or was it simply the most efficient way to house and feed a large group of people in a harsh climate? From your perspective, it was both. It was a place of warmth and community, a refuge from the brutal cold. But it was also a place of constant work, of endless cooking, and of a quiet, unending battle against dirt, disease, and the smoky air. You were the one who kept the heart of the mead hall beating, and you did it with tired hands, a weary spirit, and a quiet sense of duty. The open sea, the creak of the longship, the endless horizon, these were the hallmarks of a Viking raid or voyage. But for you, the cook, it meant a new, even more challenging culinary frontier. Travel rations. Preparing food for long journeys. For men who would be rowing for days on end, facing storms and battles, was a specialized, often miserable task. You weren't just thinking about taste. You were thinking about longevity, portability, and pure, unadulterated calories. Your primary goal was sustenance. The food had to be incredibly high in energy, easily digestible, and, crucially, non-perishable. Fresh food was out of the question after the first day or two. This meant a diet dominated by dried and smoked meats and fish, hardtack, and perhaps some dried berries if you were lucky. Imagine trying to eat that for weeks on end, the same salty, chewy, often flavorless fare, day after day, your body screaming for something fresh, something green. A mainstream historical fact is that preserved foods like dried cod and jerky were essential for long sea voyages across many cultures, not just the Vikings, because they wouldn't spoil and provided crucial protein. The preparation of these rations was a meticulous process. You'd spend days, sometimes weeks, before a voyage, salting vast quantities of fish and meat, hanging them in the smoky longhouse rafters to dry and cure. The harder and drier, the better, as this meant less chance of spoilage. Then came the hardtack, a simple, unleavened bread baked until it was rock hard. You'd mix grain with water, roll it flat, and bake it until it was practically devoid of moisture. It was so hard you could break a tooth on it, and it often had to be soaked in water or ale to make it even remotely edible. A quirky tidbit is that traces of beetles and weevils are often found in archaeological samples of ancient ships' biscuits, suggesting that even the most carefully prepared rations were often a living ecosystem by the end of a long journey. You'd learn to just pick them out, or simply accept them as extra protein. Storage on the longship was another nightmare. Space was incredibly limited, and everything had to be packed tightly into wooden barrels or leather pouches, secured against the constant pitching and rolling of the ship. You had to ensure the food was protected from seawater, which could ruin an entire supply, and from rats, who were always a menace on any ship. The smell of salt, cured meat, and damp wood would permeate everything, a constant reminder of your claustrophobic pantry. Cooking on a longship during a voyage was almost impossible. Open fires were a massive risk, especially on a wooden vessel at sea. So, the food you prepared before departure had to be mostly ready to eat. Hot meals were a rare luxury, perhaps only possible when the ship was beached or anchored in a sheltered cove. This meant the warriors would be eating cold, hard rations, their stomachs constantly rumbling, their energy levels slowly depleting. You knew that a well-fed warrior was a more effective one, but the limitations of the environment often made that impossible. Historians still argue whether the physical toll of a long-ship journey, combined with the monotonous and nutritionally limited diet, contributed to Viking aggression upon landing. Were they simply starving and desperate for fresh provisions, making raids a more immediate necessity than mere conquest? From your perspective, watching the weary, gaunt faces of the returning warriors, the answer was clear. The journey was brutal, and the food was just barely enough to keep them going. You bore the responsibility of preparing those meager, life-sustaining rations, knowing that for months, sometimes years, they would be the only thing standing between your warriors and utter exhaustion, or worse, starvation at sea. It was a testament to your quiet perseverance, transforming the raw bounty of the land into the fuel that powered the Viking Age. In a world defined by raiding and conquest, your role as a cook might seem insignificant, but it was, in fact, a cornerstone of the entire social structure. You occupied a strange, ambiguous position within Viking society, essential but often overlooked, respected for your skills, but with a social standing that was a far cry from that of a warrior or a chieftain. Your life was a testament to the fact that not all power is loud, and not all influence comes from the tip of a sword. You were the one who held the community together. A chieftain might win battles and bring home treasure, but without you, there was no one to turn that bounty into sustenance. A farmer might bring in a harvest, but without you, that grain was just so many dry kernels. Your skills were a form of currency, a crucial part of the social contract. You weren't a slave, but you weren't a noble either. You were something in between, a specialist whose knowledge was too valuable to be ignored, but whose work was too mundane to be celebrated in sagas. A mainstream historical fact is that while Norse society was highly stratified, with clear distinctions between thralls, slaves, carls freemen, and jarls nobles, skilled craftspeople and specialists, including cooks, often occupied a unique and slightly elevated position within the freemen class due to their vital contributions to the community's survival. Your status was also tied to the abundance of your kitchen. A good cook, one who could keep the community well fed through the long, lean winters, was a treasure. A bad cook, one who let food spoil or made people sick, was a liability. The pressure to succeed was immense, and your reputation was tied to the health and happiness of the people you served. A feast, as we've discussed, wasn't just a big meal. It was a public performance of your skills. The praise you received, or the criticism you endured, was a direct reflection of your social standing. Remember that one time a visiting chieftain complimented your smoked herring? It was a moment of quiet pride, a rare public acknowledgement of the value of your work. But your social standing was also precarious. In a world of physical strength and martial prowess, your power was quiet and domestic. You were often a woman, and while women in Viking society had more rights and a higher status than in many other cultures of the time, their power was still largely confined to the home. Your domain was the hearth, and your authority was over the food and the household. You were a vital part of the system, but you were rarely the one making the grand decisions. A quirky tidbit is that archaeological finds show that Viking women often had keys to their own households, a symbolic representation of their authority over the domestic sphere. You, the cook, were the wielder of those keys, the master of your kitchen, and a quiet source of power. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' fierce independence and individualistic culture had a significant impact on the role of women and the social status of domestic workers. Was your position as a cook a sign of a more egalitarian society, or was it simply a practical necessity that was still subject to the larger patriarchal structures? From your perspective, it was a little of both. You had a quiet authority over your domain, a deep knowledge that was respected by all. But you also knew that your power was limited, and that your work, while vital, was still seen as a domestic chore. You were the one who kept the community alive, but you were not the one who would be remembered in the sagas. Your legacy was not in heroic deeds, but in full bellies, healthy children, and a community that survived another winter because of your quiet, relentless work. You were a guardian, a provider, and a silent hero in a world that only celebrated the loud and the violent. In the quiet moments, when the fire was low and the mead hall was still, you'd think about the future. And for the future, you needed to think about the past. How did your ancestors, with even cruder tools, manage to feed their communities? Their secrets lay in the clever, though rudimentary methods of preservation that you had inherited and perfected. These weren't just cooking techniques. They were survival mechanisms, a deep and practical knowledge passed down through generations of cooks like you. Drying was your most fundamental weapon against spoilage. You'd catch a fish, gut it, and then hang it on a wooden rack to dry in the cold, windy air. The constant Scandinavian breeze, combined with the low temperatures, would slowly, inexorably, pull the moisture out of the fish, turning it into a hard, brittle, and almost indestructible source of protein. A quirky tidbit is that this method, known as stockfish, is still used in parts of Scandinavia today, a direct link to the survival techniques of your Viking ancestors. You'd have racks of fish hanging everywhere, outside the longhouse, in the smoky rafters, wherever the air could do its work. It was a simple, elegant solution to a massive problem. Smoking was another crucial technique, one that you practiced daily. The smoke from the central hearth, while a health hazard, was also a powerful preservative. You'd hang strips of meat and fish in the rafters, and the constant, acrid smoke would infuse the food, killing bacteria and sealing it against the elements. It gave the food a distinct smoky flavor that you had come to love, a taste that was synonymous with survival itself. But the process was a delicate one. Too much smoke, and the food would taste burnt. Too little, and it would spoil. You had to have a deep, almost instinctual understanding of the fire and the smoke to get it just right. Salting, as we've mentioned before, was a race against time. You'd pack fish and meat into barrels, layering them with coarse sea salt to draw out the moisture and prevent spoilage. Salt was a precious commodity, a trade good that was as valuable as gold. A mainstream historical fact is that salt was so crucial for food preservation that control over salt mines and trade routes was a major source of wealth and power in the ancient and medieval world. You'd use it sparingly, but when you had a good haul of fish, you'd use every last grain of it to ensure that the catch would last through the winter. The barrels of salted fish and meat were your winter insurance, a quiet promise that your community would not starve. Fermentation was the final, and perhaps most mysterious, of your preservation methods. You'd make a kind of sour milk, a thick, tangy yogurt-like substance that would last for weeks. You'd also ferment some of your grains and vegetables, a process that not only preserved them, but also made them more digestible and added a unique flavor. A lot of this was based on trial and error, on ancient knowledge passed down through generations. You wouldn't have understood the science, but you knew that a bubbling barrel of sour milk meant that you had another source of food for the lean months ahead. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' reliance on these preservation techniques was a result of necessity or a deliberate culinary tradition. Was it simply a way to survive, or did it evolve into a cultural preference for smoked, salted, and dried foods? From your perspective, it was a little of both. The need for survival was the driving force, but over time, these flavors had become the flavors of home, the tastes of your childhood, the smells of your kitchen. You were not just a cook. You were a keeper of ancient knowledge, a living library of preservation techniques that had kept your people alive for centuries. You were a bridge between the past and the future, a quiet guardian of a culinary heritage born of grit, ingenuity, and a deep-seated desire to survive. Beyond the daily grind of preparing food for survival, there was a deeper, more profound role for you as a cook. Food was not just fuel, it was a conduit for ritual, a tool for celebration, and a link to the divine. In a world where the line between the mundane and the magical was thin, you, the one who transformed raw ingredients into nourishment, were also a guardian of your community's spiritual life. The food you prepared carried a weight far heavier than its simple physical form. Feasts, as we've seen, were not just about eating. They were a time for religious observance, for making offerings to the gods, and for honoring your ancestors. The food you prepared for these occasions was special, carefully selected, and meticulously cooked. A mainstream historical fact is that archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows offerings of food, often animal bones and grains, placed in specific locations, suggesting a deep connection between sustenance and spirituality. You'd be responsible for preparing these offerings, making sure they were perfect, a gesture of respect and hope that the gods would look favorably upon your village. The act of cooking itself was a ritual. The central fire, the heart of the home, was a sacred space. You'd tend it with a deep sense of reverence, knowing that its warmth and power were a gift from the gods. You'd whisper prayers over the bubbling cauldron, asking for a successful hunt, a bountiful harvest, and a safe journey for the warriors. The preparation of food was a quiet, personal form of worship, a way to connect with the forces that governed your world. A quirky tidbit is that traces of ritual feasting have been found in ancient burial mounds, with food and drink left for the deceased, suggesting that the journey to the afterlife was also seen as a time for a final meal. You'd be the one to prepare that last ceremonial supper, a final act of love and respect for a lost loved one. Food was also a central part of the social fabric. Sharing a meal was a profound act of community, a way to forge bonds and build trust. The mead hall, with its long communal tables, was a place where people came together, not just to eat, but to be together. The food you served was the catalyst for these interactions. It was the backdrop for sagas and stories, for toasts and celebrations. You were, in a way, the master of ceremonies, setting the stage for the most important social moments of your community's life. Historians still argue whether the Viking social structure was more communal or individualistic. Was the act of sharing a meal a genuine expression of community? Or was it a practical necessity in a society where resources were scarce, and a shared meal was simply the most efficient way to eat? From your perspective, it was a little of both. The necessity was real, but the bonds forged over a shared meal were also very genuine. You, the cook, were a guardian of these rituals. You knew the songs to sing when you were churning butter, the stories to tell when you were grinding grain. Your work was a living, breathing history, a continuous link to the past. The food you prepared carried the memories of your ancestors, the hopes of your community, and the quiet prayers you whispered into the smoke of the hearth. Your legacy was not in the battles won or the lands conquered, but in the simple, profound acts of love and survival that happened in your kitchen every single day. The food was a silent language, and you were its most eloquent speaker, a quiet hero in a world that only celebrated the loud and the violent. The fire is dying down now, the embers glowing a soft, warm red. The longhouse is quiet, the sounds of sleep and soft breathing filling the space. The smells of smoked fish and wood smoke linger in the air, a familiar scent that is the smell of home. Your work is done for the day, but you know it will begin again with the first light. You close your eyes, the warmth of the fire on your face, and you are not just a cook. You are a keeper of the flame, a weaver of stories, and a silent hero in the age of the Vikings. As the last embers glow and the longhouse settles into the deep quiet of the night, your senses, so attuned to the smoke, the warmth, the life of the kitchen, begin to soften. The sharp smells of cooked fish and cured meat gently fade, replaced by the subtle, comforting scent of damp earth and the hushed breath of sleeping forms around you. Your body, weary from the day's ceaseless labor, feels the pull of rest, a deep, restorative calm washing over you. Imagine the soft rustle of the rushes on the floor as you finally lie down, the distant murmur of the sea a lullaby. gently rocking you into slumber. The anxieties of spoiled food, of hungry mouths, of treacherous fires slowly recede, dissolving into the vast protective darkness that envelops the world outside. The history you've lived, the struggles, the small triumphs, they all blur into a comforting haze, a distant echo of lives profoundly lived. Let your mind drift, carried on the gentle currents of this ancient world, knowing that for tonight the work is done, the village is fed, and peace has finally settled upon the land.